My quilting friends, Leah Day here with a new episode all about teaching classes. Now, teaching quilting classes can happen in a lot of different ways now. You can travel and teach. That means that you travel to different quilt shops or quilt guilds and you set up and do lectures or workshops for those guilds, for those groups. You can also teach online. Sites like Craftsy. I've taught for Craftsy, and that can be very lucrative as well. You can also create your own classes on your own website, and that's something that I'm doing a lot now, where I create workshops and teach different techniques in the workshop setting, and then I create that and have it set up as a download, and I can reach people from all over the world and teach something really cool. But I think that the question that I was being asked, this whole episode came about from a woman named Suzanne on Instagram, and she asked about how do you prepare and teach a class, from preparing to actual class time to post-class. And I really think that she was meaning an in-person class. So that's going to be my focus for this episode. I'm going to really talk in depth about it. And I'm sure in the future, if there's enough interest, if you guys are interested in learning more about teaching online classes, I can definitely do another whole podcast episode just about that. So this is going to focus in on teaching in person. And I have taught in person dozens of times. I think that's safe to say. I don't think I've taught 100 times in person, though. It's not ever been a big focus of mine, mostly because I found early on that I could teach in video, and that required me not to have to leave the house. So that became almost instantaneously my preferred method of teaching. But I did travel and teach for a bit from 2010 until about 2015. I did teach at a couple big places. MQX East was probably the biggest. And I had really great experiences, whether it was teaching in a quilt guild setting or in a quilt shop. Every time I taught, I always tried to focus in on, what is my focus? What is my goal with this? And it always came down to, I just want people to leave ready to quilt, ready to make this thing that we're making, whether it was these quilting designs or that project. And I really want them to be successful at it. And this is something that I think is really important. You need to tap into what you want to teach, and also why you want to teach it. And please do take the time to do that and make sure that you really want to teach these techniques and you want to see people succeed at them. And I think this is important to explain this way because several times I've been in classes and it feels like the teacher doesn't want her students to be successful. And it's so weird when this happens. It feels just to have a really, really strange example, like imagine being in third grade and your teacher is teaching you how to do multiplication tables. This is what James is learning right now. He's actually just finished up his multiplication tables. And yet she keeps saying, no, that's not the way you do it, but I'm not going to teach you exactly how to do it. Or someone asks a question and she just smiles and doesn't actually answer it. And I have seen that happen in quilting classes by nationally recognized teachers who clearly don't really want you to go home and use the techniques. They don't want you to be successful. And so I think that is something that really bothers me. When I see it, it really irritates me. And I've taken classes from different teachers that, I liked when I saw what they did online, or I liked what they did. I liked their quilts, or I liked their technique, or whatever it was. But then when I met them in person, it was like, wow, this is ridiculous. I did not learn, number one, I did not learn anything in this class. And then number two, I honestly don't even want to use these techniques because I'm afraid that she's going to come after me with a copyright lawsuit. So I think the first thing and most important thing is to tap into, do you actually want to teach this? And it's perfectly fine if that answer is no. If you have a technique that you've created that's very unique to you and your quilts, and you don't want other people to do it, and you don't really want to see it out there, then that's fine. Give yourself permission not to teach that. Teach something else. Teach how to, a construction technique instead, or teach a machine quilting design instead. If there's something that feels very precious to you, then it is a-okay to save it. But here's the one thing I have to warn you about. There is a thing called, I can't remember the name. It's basically a term for a same invention being invented by multiple people at the exact same time. It's kind of spontaneous creativity or something like that. Basically, when it's this idea that when the world is ready for something to be born, it will send multiple people the same inspiration. And so you might have a really cool, awesome technique that's really unique to you. But guess what? Someone else probably also has that glue and that fabric and that starch and that iron and that stitching ability and that foot and whatever else is required, and she can probably do it too. So understand that even if you don't teach a technique, that doesn't necessarily mean that you will never see it out in the world. Someone else can come up with it as well. So now that we've kind of gotten off my soapbox, as you can see, this is something that I feel very passionate about, and I think it's very important. I think it's very important for teachers to want to teach and want to share and have that be their core value for teaching. And I think that's far more important than even how the class flows or even how, things get off the ground. I think it's very important for you to want to share your information and you want to see people succeed. So now let's talk about actually creating a class, a quilting class from the ground up. And the first thing, it just has to start with a concept. What do you want to teach in class? And that could be a very simple quilt, a technique. A technique usually, if it's like, let's say, here's a construction technique that I've been playing with for a little while, and that's a stained glass applique. So stained glass applique is a technique where I could design a quilt and do a class where students come and we set and we make that quilt together using that stained glass technique. And then everyone understood both the technique and the quilt and made the quilt at the same time. So that would be kind of a cool way of merging the two together. You could also do a class where there is not a project, but there is a technique. So something like, okay, well, I'm just going to teach you how to do the stained glass applique. Maybe we'll just randomly cut out some shapes and randomly put them together. And then if you want to call that a quilt at the end, you can. Or you could just throw it in the trash, or you could save it as a sample. It's totally up to you. But to not have that attachment to that specific wall hanging quilt or that specific design. Now that can be a little tricky because obviously in order to get people to sign up for your class and to come, you're going to have samples, and something to show for the class. So that would need to be very clear in how you market the class and what you title it, that kind of thing. Like Learn Stained Glass Applique would obviously, to me, say a very obvious technique class. If it is make a stained glass applique wall hanging, then that would tell me I'm going to go in there and I'm going to make that stained glass applique wall hanging quilt, that specific one. The third type of class is a machine quilting class, and that's kind of different from both teaching an actual quilt and teaching a technique. It's kind of technique on steroids, and that is you're teaching machine quilting, whether it's walking foot quilting or free motion quilting or long arm quilting. It's very specific, and it does not require any fabric cutting. It doesn't require irons. It's very simple in its nature of we just need something to quilt. Now, it could be very tempting to think, okay, well, let's have everyone bring in quilts and we quilt them together. And that might work if you're in like a big expo type setting or a big show type setting where that could actually be possible. Most of the time when I've been teaching in quilt shops, there's just not room to do that kind of thing. So what I've done always with teaching machine quilting is to have people bring in cut squares, usually 10-inch squares, and then we mark a square inside of it, usually an 8-inch square inside, and then quilt that square. Now, does quilting that square really apply to your whole quilt? Yes and no. And that comes in, you have to then be very careful in your instruction of saying, okay, well, we've learned something on a small scale, or we've learned it in this small space. How do we expand it? And to spend part of your class time explaining that and sharing samples. So that is definitely something I think that's important no matter what type or style of quilting class that you're wanting to teach is samples. So make 3 to 4 versions of the quilt that you're going to teach and have, or if it's machine quilting, then have the design stitched out. If it's a technique, then make sure that you have several different quilts showcasing that technique. So it's really, really clear how many different ways it can be used. And this does more than one thing. Having samples and having multiple versions of something, it is eye candy for the students. It lets them see how to use the technique, and it gives you much more skill in doing that technique. It gives you a lot more experience and knowledge as far as the pitfalls. You know, what can happen, then how can this go wrong? Those are two really important things that you need to be able to answer before you teach the class. And that is another thing. Just make sure that when you're teaching a class that you're ready to teach it, you're ready to share it, and that you've gotten enough experience with that topic or that quilt to be able to share it and to answer those questions and to deal with those problems. And, you know, a good chunk of my machine quilting classes have to do with darning feet, making sure that the darning foot works properly, getting the settings correct on a machine, sorting out stitch issues, whether it's skip stitches, breaking thread, any number, getting the right needle in the machine. All of that stuff can be quite overwhelming if that's still a struggle for you to deal with yourself. If you've already worked past that and you feel pretty confident that you kind of know the answers to those questions, or you know how to troubleshoot them, then you're ready to teach that, absolutely. But if something happens to your machine, you're like, I have no idea what's going on, then that might not yet be a technique that you want to share, simply because when that happens to a student, and it most certainly will, they will want you to answer it for them. They will want you to fix it for them. And if you can't, there's going to be someone that's upset with you. And that's never fun either for the student or for the teacher. It's never fun for anybody. So samples are key, and I think the more samples, the better. When I've gone to shows, to different classes and stuff, when it's a big quilt, I've seen teachers teaching, huge piecing classes with huge quilts and stuff. Usually they only have 1 or 2 versions of the quilt with them, from what I've seen. When it's a smaller quilt, like a baby or wall hanging, usually there's multiple versions of the quilt. You can see lots of different fabric combinations. You can see that technique illustrated many different ways. And I think that's really interesting because fabric has the ability to attract or repel us. So that I might look at a wall hanging and it's all done in gray and brown and blue, and it is ugly in my opinion. But I see that exact same wall hanging in bright orange, red, and purple. And I'm like, give me some more of that, guys. Like I would love it. So, you've got to also keep in mind that your samples are big time marketing for your class. And having a wide variety of colors and patterns is a really good idea. And also it kind of illustrates, if it's a piecing class, it illustrates what you can do depending on the fabric. There are some quilts that if you quilt it, you cut it out with like a border print, it would look completely different if you cut it out from a solid, So there's lots of variation there and lots of ways that you can be creative. And as you're being creative, you're also learning and experimenting and figuring out the pitfalls, the problems, the issues that could arise as you teach. I should say also, as you're creating those samples, you're also learning how to streamline it. It might be that when you start a technique out, it's 17 steps from the beginning to the finished, nice finished edge. But as you do it over and over and over again, you start realizing, well, I can skip step 10 and I don't need to do that extra basting, or if we use this kind of glue instead of that kind of glue, then it'll hold better and I won't need to do that step. It'll streamline it, so you'll be able to cut things out and simplify it and just narrow down to what needs to be taught in a very logical, very streamlined way. And I would also advise keeping the samples small so that way they could be passed around. And when you pass them around, please make it clear that photography is absolutely allowed and that people can shoot photos and they can, analyze your stitching and look real close at it, the whole 9 yards of that. Don't be afraid of that. That's what you're there for. You are a vessel to share the information. And by passing it around, people can spend more time with it. They can hold on, if it's a pot holder size, they can hold it, they can squish it, they can, see how those stitches look real close, they can flip it over on the back. I mean, this is what quilters like to do. I have never seen a student look at my quilts and not flip them over to look at them on the back and it is judgment, to judge what the stitches look like. Do they look as good on the back as they do on the front? And I see it and I smile because I do it myself. It's just what we do, So having them small, at least a handful of samples that you can pass around is really nice. And that stops the hauling everybody out of their seat thing. This is just my own pet peeve. And I'm sorry I'm including a whole lot of my opinion in this post, but I really, I have some really strong opinions when it comes to quilting classes. But whenever I demo, and I only demo twice during a class, it always changes the energy of the class because everyone has to kind of get up out of their seats and they all kind of cluster around. Well, I noticed over time that stretching out that standing up and staring time to longer than 5 minutes is uncomfortable for most students. They really don't want, and even as a student myself, I know I don't want to be standing up kind of breathing down the neck of the quilting teacher. I would rather stay in my seat and hold and look at something or photograph something from the comfort of my seat and my machine. So that's another reason why I think small samples are really helpful. And I limit demoing time to really 2 times during class and for 5 minutes. I do it right at lunchtime where, kind of everybody's already getting up and shifting around and say like, here, let me just show you those stitches, those designs that we've gone over this morning. And so I'll stitch those out, everybody goes to lunch, and then I might do a little bit of stitching after lunch. And then towards the end of the class, everyone's packing up, I'll demo then. So that way people are already in that standing up, moving around the class kind of activity, and they're not as disrupted, as they would be if they had taken the time to get their machines all set up. They're all comfortable. If it's a really packed class, it can be kind of a pain to squeeze through people in order to get up and come and watch. And even then, if it's a lot of people in class, it can be hard to see around so many heads all around the machine when the teacher's demoing. So I think for all of those reasons, lots of samples, and keep your samples small so they can be passed around. And, be comfortable with photography of all sizes, and I am even comfortable with people shooting video of me, but that's just me. I completely understand if you're not comfortable with video necessarily, but at the same time, how can it hurt? You're there to teach the student. You want them to be successful at it. They might not necessarily put that video up online, but if they go home, they can reference it and they can see your techniques again, and they'll be more apt to be able to do it. So now to kind of pull all that together, a handout, some kind of paper document that will solidify all of the information and give you a place where the student can not only get back in touch with you, but also remember what they've learned. I think a handout is pretty crucial to any quilting class. And make sure that whenever you format your handout, you add headers and footers to the page so that you can include your name and your website in the header and footer of each page, front and back. Now this does a couple different things. It not only reminds people where they can find you, but it also stops any copyright infringement. I have heard from quilters that are like, well, so-and-so copied my handout and is teaching my class and ripping me off and all this other stuff. And I've heard this before, and my solution is, well, did you not put a copyright notice on your handout, or did you not put your name on your handout that you designed yourself and you wrote, that kind of thing. So you can fix that if that's a problem for you, or if that's something that would bother you, then you could fix it that way. I think it's just generally a good idea to put your name on the handout so that way people remember who you are and can come back and find you and find more information about you. Whenever you're designing that document, you want to start with your materials list, a little overview of the class, what people are going to learn, materials list as far as what they're going to need. If it's a quilt pattern, obviously they're going to need that quilt pattern in order to make it successfully. And if you end up having space, a lot of times I will see like a pattern printed on one side of the paper and then the whole back being left open and blank. Use that back side too. That can be an advertisement for your store. That could be an advertisement for your book. You could put in a little blurb about the products that you sell, or the, if the different things that you do, or your next class that's going to be nearby in a local town. Whatever it is, use the space available to you and use it up. If it's going to be a handout printed front and back, make sure every single inch of that space is used up. So that way it feels very dense and very heavy, and people will value it. I think that's the most important thing. I was struggling with this for a while. I was printing out it was a 4-page handout stapled. I mean, it was a lot of work, especially for a class 20 students. It's a lot of paper, and that's a lot of time to print that out and staple them all together and all that kind of stuff. And I had a few students that left theirs behind, and it was really bugging me. And I looked at the handout and I realized, there wasn't enough value in it. I was giving them, I wasn't giving them enough information, or it wasn't valuable enough for them to take it home with them and save it. So my solution to that, and I think this is a really good kind of entry point into writing books, was I took that handout and turned it into a book. And that became one of my first books, Free Motion Quilting from Daisy to Paisley. And then I did it again when I wanted to update my class and kind of change up the designs. Then it became a class I would teach with Free Motion Quilting from Feathers to Flames. And so both of those books were basically handouts turned into books with much more designs added. And no one's going to throw a book away, And then it not only added value to the class, and that the students would continue learning after the class, it also added value in the sense that I could, charge the additional fee for the book, and that helped the class be more profitable for me. And this is something that I think is really important. When you're teaching, you've got to calculate in, obviously your time away, how much time you're going to be away from home, how long it's going to take you to get to the class, how long a drive, or if you have to fly, or any of that kind of stuff. And then the effort involved, making those samples, the technique, all that kind of stuff goes into that as well. And look at it, that is a very good way of making money. Yes, at the same time, I also would say, with that caveat, you don't want to skin the sheep. You don't want to have so many things priced so high and so ridiculously that people feel like they're getting ripped off. Keep your class fee reasonable, or if you're working with a quilt shop, make sure that they're comfortable with your class fee and everything's good there. And then if you are offering a book or something, offering some sort of discount for the shop, where the shop is basically wholesaling them from you or buying them from a distributor, then the shop is obviously making money too. If it's a guild setting, obviously there's no shop involved, so there's no squishiness there or involved with that. So you can kind of just offer the book, say, hey, if you have a book, that's great, just bring it. But if you don't have a book yet, then here I'll have them available for sale. And that does make the class more profitable, and that allows you to then make more classes, and then to make more quilts and make more patterns, and to keep your business running. So it all goes into itself and is all helpful. And I think that's turning a handout into a book. It worked out really successfully for me. And it was both of those are small books. They're 100 pages, and they're mini books. They're 5 by 8s. Yeah, 5.5 by 8.5 inches. So they're small books. And so they were very easy to keep right next to the sewing machine too. And I did self-publish those. And that was one of those things that I know that if I had approached a big publisher, they would have been like, well, why do we want a mini size? Or, this seems weird. And I didn't even want to have that conversation. I knew what I wanted, and I wanted to produce that book. And that's why I self-published it. And that in turn made it that much more successful. So I think all of those things are really important, making sure that you have a class that's ready to go, that you're ready to teach those techniques, you want to share them, make some samples, create a handout, That's all the upfront work of the class. So now the next thing is testing it, making sure that you're ready to teach it. Because it's one thing, you've done all this work, but some of it might be kind of in your head, you know what I mean? Where you've tried out a technique and you're really good at it, but you might be assuming someone is already understanding and accepting several steps of that technique. So just an example for that for me is the whole extra steps of pre-washing, starching, and pressing fabric. I made the mistake for many years of assuming that everyone would do this. And that was not cool. You can't assume that someone is going to know that that's how you prepare things. And so it became then a very big deal to emphasize that step, to emphasize the absolute basics. Like, I think you should pre-wash your fabric. That is my opinion, but I am your teacher. Therefore, I think you should pre-wash this fabric. And yes, I do think starch is perfectly fine to use on the fabric, and it gets it stiff and it makes it easy to control and more accurate to cut. So all of that is kind of in my, it sets the foundation for how I'm teaching. And if I assume someone knows that and they don't, then they could be starting off with a really bad foundation to their class and have a really unsuccessful class because of that, a really unsuccessful experience. So testing your class will really help you with that. And you can do this in a lot of different ways. You could just, it'd be as simple as if you have a willing spouse or friend to come over, and then you could run through the class with them and really practice the introduction. Really practice how you greet your students and how you start out the class, like what kind of beat and what kind of emotion you're wanting to set off from the very beginning. I always try and start with a good dose of energy, and I'm always like, hello, Leah Day here. And, the same way I start my videos, I try and start my classes the same way. And I usually also start with a lot of instructions written on the board, like, I know you're getting ready and, kind of getting everything set up, and it's a lot of work, but whenever you get the chance, here's what you can do with your machine. So I always start off letting people know how they can kind of get started and get established. And that really sets up the students that show up early to set up. That really gets them started on the right foot. And usually those students, the ones that feel most comfortable and confident by the end of class. You're always going to have those students that are showing up right on time, exactly when the class started. And of course, then they're usually a little bit behind throughout the class because they didn't have that time to set up and really kind of get comfortable before class started. It's always nice to kind of put that information like, hey, you can show up 30 minutes ahead of time. It's good to put that in your materials list if you can. Some places don't allow you to do that. Quilt guilds and stuff, sometimes you have to show up right at 9 and no one gets any extra time, and that's okay. But I think the beginning, the intro to class, introducing yourself, letting people know who you are, what you're going to learn, what your expectations for the class are, I think that's a really important time. I think that's a really important place to practice and make sure that that's setting off on the right foot. If you don't have a friend, another idea would be to host like a really small class. Do a little ad in your quilt guild and say, hey, I'd love to have 4 to 5 members come for a class. It'd be free at my house, or maybe we could rent time at the church or at the guild meeting house or wherever, and get together and that be free for those members, and they could be your guinea pigs, So that's another way that you could test a class out and just see if it works and if it flows well. What you're looking for there is you're wanting to get experience at the teaching, not just the technique, but at the teaching. Look out for stale spots. That's where, maybe half the students have kind of reached where you are and they're waiting for the next step, but then you want everyone else to catch up too, and it kind of gets stale. Like, do you go in ahead and jump ahead and then have to teach twice? That can be really tricky, having students at different places in a class. And I've seen that myself, where kind of everyone almost got on everyone was at a different stage in the project and depended upon the teacher to help them to the next stage. And it was a nightmare for the poor teacher because she had to go around to every single student individually to give that extra instruction. So watch out for that. Try and, figure out ways of keeping all the students in the right, kind of in the right range or in the same place. Or if like in the situation you have irons being used, usually there's only 3 or 4 irons across, a huge amount of people. Figure out ways of splitting up that class so that there's not just a huge big line in front of the iron, and lots of standing around and waiting. That's never much fun. And of course, it's not always possible to get around it. You can just be aware that it's going to happen. And so then maybe if that's going to happen in your class and you can't do anything about it, prepare some stories, some funny anecdotes to tell during those times. So it just keeps it flowing. It keeps that energy up, makes people laugh. I'll do a lot of cheap stuff to get a laugh. I really want my classes to be entertaining. And that's gotten me in trouble a little bit because sometimes, like, I'll swear in a class where I won't ever swear at a video, but I'll swear in a class just to like get a cheap laugh, just to keep that emotion and like that energy flowing and make sure everybody's still awake. And it doesn't always work out well. So I think I've gotten myself in trouble with it a few times, but at the same time, at the end of class, you can tell when a student is happy and satisfied and has had a great experience. And when, she's been kind of like nodding off, I've also seen students nod off in my classes too. And I think that happens as well. You can't be perfect for everybody, but you can always try your best. So one last thing to test as you're teaching your class, let's say it's a 6-hour class and you've got a whole quilt to create. It would be good to know if it's reasonable to expect your students to have the entire quilt done, or if they will have to take it home to finish it. If it's a small wall hanging, it's a simple enough technique, they might be able to finish it in class, right? Even if it's a bed quilt and it's a simple enough piecing technique, they might be able to get it finished in class. But you won't actually know until you work through it with some real people and kind of figure out those trouble spots, if something's going to hang people up, if the line at the irons is going to be so ridiculous that, half the class, kind of flags behind the other half the class. It's just good to know all of those types of things and just be aware of them. So now for the actual class. I think I mentioned this before. Be on time. Be ready for your intro. Have that down. More than anything else, I think that's important. And I've met a few teachers that kind of, I wouldn't say botched the introduction, but just it really set the class off kind of on the wrong foot. And it took her a while to pull everyone back around. And it's almost like getting people on your side is the way I look at it. A lot of times when I start a class, of course, I'm in my 30s and I look young. And a lot of times I feel like I have to kind of jump people into machine quilting really quickly in order for them to be willing to listen to me. And that could be just my own insecurities coming out. But I have found that that's generally the best way to start. So I try and talk very little at the beginning. I introduce myself. I say I'm Leah Day from the Free Motion Quilting Project. I'm so happy to be here. And then, we're going to learn about free motion quilting. I list the settings that people can try out on their machines, and then just jump right into the very first design that we're going to stitch together. And I draw it. I like to have a whiteboard. My absolute favorite place to teach is We're So Creative in Concord, North Carolina. And the reason I love to teach there is she has mounted a teaching whiteboard to the back of the room so that, I don't even have to hold it. It's there on the wall. It's like a classroom. It's wonderful. So I love that space because I can draw up the design and leave it there and then only have to erase it, whenever I need to move on to the next technique. So I'll draw that on the board, ask for questions, say, okay, go stitch. And usually that intro lasts about 5 minutes. And then I start walking around to all the students. And anybody that's kind of walked in late, I introduce myself, shake their hand, give them some one-on-one attention, talk about, the settings, if they need some help getting started. A lot of times in the first initial kind of walkthrough, I'm looking for anyone having problems with their foot. If it's a closed-toed foot, I usually will mention breaking it at that point. Usually within the first 2 or 3 hours, I'll start walking around and breaking feet for people. And that means there's a video on it online. I'll link to it so that way you can see what I mean. basically break the foot open and then stop it from hopping. They're thankfully becoming far less common, but that style of foot can be really challenging to learn with. And I always offer that right at the beginning. And then I'm also looking for, any thread issues. I bring thread with me to class so that if a student's struggling, then they can just grab a spool of isocord or a spool of R-fill and try that instead. A lot of times they won't feed properly from like the pin on the machine, so I'll switch to a spool stand or just put it kind of on the tabletop and feed the thread up and then into the machine, and that oftentimes works a lot better. So I'm looking for all of those little things that are kind of easy to fix, that are easy to notice and pull out and fix quickly. And then I'm also just walking around being encouraging. Usually those first stitches are kind of terrifying and it's all crazy and wobbly. Usually I start with stippling as the first design in a machine quilting class. And it might be a little scary and, like, oh my gosh, mine doesn't look anything like yours, that kind of thing. I hear that a lot. And, it's all about being encouraging and supportive. That looks great. It might not look all that great, but if it's good enough to put on a quilt, I tell the student immediately, like, wow, that looks awesome. That is ready to go on your next quilt. Because I think more than anything else, especially with machine quilting, a lot of times students will question their experience so much that they won't actually go home and do it. They won't actually go home and continue to try and actually put it on a real quilt. So they never really build the skill. So I see it as really important to let students know that they are ready. You are ready to put that on a quilt. You are ready to stitch that out. In a piecing class, I think this would come in looking around at people's 1/4-inch seam. Like, hey, do you have a 1/4-inch foot? Let's double check and see if you have a patchwork foot in your supplies. Or let's measure that 1/4-inch seam. Carry around a ruler in your hand and measure that 1/4-inch seam and give some tips on making it more accurate. If a student is struggling with like points being lopped off or seams not coming out right or the block not coming out exactly right. And that'll also allow you to catch it if like someone's stitching something wrong, then you'll catch it before they stitch too far and you'll be able to catch it and get them back on track, whether they have to rip something out or just start on the next set of blocks. So being in class, this goes back again to the beginning of kind of why you teach, what you want to share, and where you're coming from. And I really think that this comes from the heart. You have to want to be there. You have to want to help. And you have to really want people to be successful. We want our students to learn how to do multiplication tables, right? Then you want them to learn that stained glass applique technique. You want them to be able to go home and do it themselves. So I hope that you will, in your classes, allow photos of your quilts, that you will answer every question that you are asked, and you will answer it as fully as you are able. And if someone asks a question that you don't know how to answer, be honest about that. Say, I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that yet, but maybe we can figure out the answer together, that kind of thing. I think the worst thing that can happen is to teach a class not to teach, but to get attention for yourself. That is not the point. That is not why people come there. That is not why people attend your class. And that is not the reason to teach a class. But I see it, and it makes me very, very sad. So I'd say that the last tip is to take a lot of classes and to pay attention to those teachers that light you up and make you feel amazing and make you want to go home and make beautiful quilts and have given you the resources to make those quilts and to do a good job with them. So pay attention to those teachers and figure out what it is that makes them so special and what it is that has made them so successful, right? And then also, when you take a class and it is horrible and makes you feel bad and makes you angry, because there have been those classes that I have left furious at the end of it because I learned very little and I just felt like I was there to stroke the ego of whatever teacher was pretending to teach the class. When that happens, pay very close attention to what made you feel that way. Was it that she just basically didn't teach, that she just demoed, that she just sat there and stitched herself the whole time? Or, was it that she didn't allow photos, that she didn't answer your questions, or how she answered your questions, how she went about responding to students, how you stand in class, to stand with your arms wide, your feet wide apart. That is an open, kind of a very open stance, a very giving stance. When someone is kind of closed up and sitting down, hunched over, that is a very closed stance. And, I know that that's getting into physicality. That's kind of coming from my yoga stuff, but it makes a difference. I know it's crazy. I have a friend who is a yoga instructor and a massage therapist. And she always gives me this advice whenever I'm going somewhere or doing something. She says, ground through your feet, spread your feet wide and ground through your feet. And I know that there's also really popular is, it's not Captain Marvel, a Wonder Woman pose. You stand with your feet apart and your hands on your hips, and it makes you look like Wonder Woman. And it is a power pose. It does make you feel better about yourself. It makes you feel more open and more giving. So, before class, stand in that pose for a good 5 minutes and kind of channel that energy, and you'll bring it to class. It might sound a little hokey, and you might feel a little hokey doing it, but I promise you, it'll make all the difference in the world. So that's it for this episode. I have really enjoyed sharing all this with you, and I hope that it will inspire you to go and teach and share this wonderful, wonderful skill of quilting with other people. I can't think of anything more amazing to be able to do. I love teaching. I love sharing this wonderful, amazing art. And what I love the most about it is that for the most part, quilters get it. They get this desire to share and this desire to spread the word and get more people addicted to it. I think most quilters understand that this is a craft that came from sharing. Our grandmothers would share quilt blocks, and they would sit down together and stitch together. My great grandmother would host quilting bees. I think it was every weekend. From what I have heard of the stories, she would have all of her sisters, and she had, I think, 8 or 9 sisters, and they would all come over to her house, and she had a quilting frame that she suspended from her ceiling. Her house was super, super tiny. So she suspended her quilting frame from the ceiling, and she'd drop it down, and she and all of her sisters would sit around the quilting frame, and they'd quilt together, and they would work together on quilts for one another. So they were all getting their stitches in, and then that quilt would go to one of them, and then they put another quilt on the frame and they'd stitch it together next. And that kind of sharing and sense of camaraderie, I think, is what makes quilting so amazing. And I think that is the most valuable thing about this craft. So if you want to teach, please teach. Please share this wonderful love and awesome craft with other people, and do it in an amazing way. I think that this has hopefully set you off on the right foot. If you have any questions, of course, you can contact me through leahday.com/contact. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook at Leah Day Quilting. And you can find the episode show notes plus links to everything I mentioned in this podcast at leahday.com/episode 5. Until next time, let's go quilt.